Our second talk this morning is from Chuan Nguyen. Chuan is a research fellow at the School of Information, and he's going to be talking about student mobility. Chuan, if you're ready to start sharing, please go ahead.
Okay, cool. So hi, everyone. My name is Quan. I'm a research fellow at the School of Information. And today I'm going to present our ongoing research project that looks at students' mobility patterns on campus and draw some implications for the planning of campus activities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we would like to acknowledge the support from Midas POTS program and also the ITS team, which help us with the data collections and data access. Right. There's a lot of decisions that need to be considered in terms of campus planning during COVID-19, such as which courses to be delivered in online or person, which group of students are more exposed, how do students actually interact with one another on campus, and also maybe which locations on campus are the most congregated. So obviously we have some intuitions in terms of these questions, but I think what we're trying to do here is to provide the data of how students actually move around campus, which could potentially help the university across the world to make better decisions in terms of campus planning during this period. So the data source that we utilized was from the Wi-Fi network dataset, right? So at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor campus, we have over 11,000 Wi-Fi access points. So as you can see, this is sort of a screenshot of this map, and each dot is a Wi-Fi access point. And so from this data, we can infer information about how students move around on campus. And the kind of data that we get is simply you have a user ID, you have the timestamp of when students is connected to an access point, a timestamp when the user was disconnected, the name of the access point, and some information about the MAC address and so on. So from this data, we can sort of plot how students move around campus, right? And it is a comparison between fall 2019 and fall 2020 on the first Wednesday of September. And with this sort of data, we can see how dense at certain places on campus is and how students might actually move around campus and which time of the day or which location is the most congregated or the most busiest during the day. And we can also infer of co-location activities from Wi-Fi signals, right? So students are presumably in a close proximity when they are connected to the same access point. So such as when they have a meeting in the same room or potentially sitting in the same lecture hall. And also the proximity also depends on the Wi-Fi coverage range, right? So, and the building lays out as well. And we can calculate the collocation time between two users. And if you see an example, so let's say Quan and Chris had a meeting at North Quad from 10 to 11, and then we can project this sort of bipartite network into a student-to-students network in which a tie between students, the tie's weight equals to the total amount of time that these two users collocated together on campus. And in this project, we collect data from all students on the UM Ann Arbor campus in fall 2019 and fall 2020, because we want to compare differences in terms of mobility patterns and how students interact with one another before and during the pandemic. And we also combine this Wi-Fi data with academic records from the Learning Analytics data set. All of these data was de-identified by ITS, and we carry out the data collections and data analysis on a server managed by ITS to preserve data security and confidentiality. And there's a lot of questions that we could ask from this data, such as, which physical spaces are the most congregated, what type of students are well connected, and how do students' mobility patterns could change before and during pandemic, and how does that affect their relate to their academic activities, their course choices, and potentially academic performance. So this is some of the initial findings. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but just to give you a taste of what we can achieve with this kind of data. So this is a visualization of how busy was Ann Arbor campus between fall 2019 and fall 2020. And you can see each month and also the hour in terms of the time of the day. And so you can see it sort of increased from August to September. There's also these slashes, which represents weekends, where you have obviously a lower number of active users. And you can also which time of the day where you have the highest number of users on campus. And you can see the same pictures in fall 2020, but obviously you can see the number of active users were much less than fall 2019, obviously. And but you can see the same patterns occur in both of the semesters. And you can also look at how much time students spent on campus, and by looking at the hours of connections to Wi-Fi networks, right? So this is fall 2019 on the left. We have data of about 50,000 students, and most of them were spent around roughly 20 hours a week on campus. But there's also this look at this bimodal distributions. There's also a second group of students who spent over 100 hours a week. So these students are typically freshmen or sophomore who stay in campus residential accommodation. And you can also see the same patterns in fall 2020. But in fall 2020, then because of the lockdown and everything, so most of the students have spent a very small amount of time on campus. But if you sort of look closer, then there's also a small number of students who spend roughly over 130 hours a week on campus. And these are typically students who stay in dorms. And then you can also look at how often students co-located with one another. In this case, we sort of did a filter of more than 15 minutes to sort of remove the noises around campus. So in this graph, you can see the median number of interactions or these sort of events when students co-located were roughly about 8,000 events, right? So most of the students have about 8,600 so-called interactions where they were collocated with another student for more than 15 minutes. And if you look at the number of students that they sort of interacted with, then the median number is about 2,000 students. So each ego networks or each students over the semester often interacted with or came in contact with 2,000 students for at least 15 minutes. And then you can also see the same patterns in fall 2020. Obviously, the amount of interactions and the interaction frequencies are much less than fall 2020. So in fall 2019. So in fall 2020, the median amount of interactions was 8 interactions. So from August until the end of October, which is when we got the latest data set. And you can also see the changes in the number of alters, which is the number of students that each individual students came in contact with. And we can also explore how busy or how dense the campus is by access points, right? So what are some of the busiest locations on campus? And you can also compare between fall 2019 and fall 2020. And particularly, so each dot represents an access point, and there's over 11,000 of them in our campus. And some of the access points have, even though they have a lower number of students, but they have an incredibly high number of interactions. So from a sort of campus planning perspective, so these access point or these location could potentially be those locations where a lot of transmission could occur, right? Because even though there's much smaller number of students, but the amount of interactions, of cross interactions on campus are particularly high in these locations. So these are just some of the initial findings that I want to show you guys, just to get a taste of what this data set can do. And in our future work, we would obviously focus and dig more into the whole campus networks, and we build centrality measures and also correlate that with the academic informations. And we can answer some of the important questions, such as how does the students' mobility patterns relate to their academic activities? Because we know that how students move around campus is dependent on multiple factors. So from their course schedule, but also the temporal pattern. So what time of the day, and also the spatial arrangement around campus, right? So students typically interact with people who are in their close physical distance with themselves. So there's a lot of things that we could explore, and I think I will give some time for questions, I think.
Thank you very much, Quan. That was really fascinating. I will check the Q&A here, and before I ask any questions out of the Q&A, I want to ask you, how long does a place like University of Michigan store this data, in the sense that you said you went back to fall 19 to compare fall 2020 numbers? How long of a timeline can you make to make these studies to do longer term trends, for instance? And related to that question is, how do you deal with kind of the growth of Wi-Fi networks and change in student populations and things like that?
Yeah, so I think if I remember correctly, but possibly ITS folks could answer this more correctly, but I think this goes back to fall 2017. But before that, because of the volume of the data, so they have to sort of discard it once in a while. They have to sort of get rid of it. But I think from fall 2017, they have been storing this data, and yes, so the size of data is gigantic, and we pick fall 2019 and fall 2020 because these are the period that we can see a significant shift in how students move around campus, but also potentially how they interact with one another. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And sorry, just a kind of a follow-up question on that. It's not a question, it's more of a comment. I don't get into the university. Maybe I don't have a lab that I can get into, so I was asked to stay at home, so I haven't been on campus but more than twice this entire term. But there's this perception that the students are just kind of running wild on campus, and there's plenty of interactions going on. Your plots and research show that this is really not the case, that in fact the interaction level on campus has been very muted. And so I was just wondering, did this research kind of surprise you in the sense that it was so damped compared to last term?
In a way, it was not, because we kind of expect that because of a lot of social distancing measures and also of the reductions in terms of in-person sort of in-person interactions time on campus. So we would expect significant reductions in terms of how students move around campus. But I think what is kind of interesting is we look at some of the spatial patterns and which locations are the most busiest between fall 2019 and fall 2020. And you can see there's a change in where students interact most of their time interacted with in fall 2020 compared to fall 2019. So that just kind of surprised me a little bit.
Okay. One quick question from the Q&A. This is kind of an important one in terms of the numbers. Do the Wi-Fi zones, the broadcast zones, are they controlled for area, kind of a local student density, or that could affect? I can imagine how the numbers appear in the counts.
Yeah, so there's some subtle nuances in Wi-Fi data. So it depends on the coverage range of each access point as well. So for example, when you have exterior Wi-Fi access points, such as sort of maybe in the DIAC, then the coverage range is much larger. So it will potentially capture a larger number of students, but in a larger proximity, whereas like we have indoor Wi-Fi, then the proximity is much smaller. But also there's a lot of noise in the data because students on campus cross path one another all the time, and there's also in situations where you have people sitting in a large lecture hall, even though they are maybe 20 feet away or 30 feet away from each other, but they were still connected to the same access point. So these some of the subtle nuances that we need to take care of in the modeling.
Thank you very much, Quan. Very, very enjoyable talking.
Thank you.